Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Perry, and I'm here today presenting on behalf of Natural Resources Canada's Canada Centre for Mapping and Earth Observation. And I'm here to present on a new mapping initiative that is driven towards increasing Canada's resilience to flooding. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce the Flood Hazard Identification and Mapping Program. The federal government has a long history with flood mapping programs, having initiated mapping projects under the Flood Damage and Reduction Program throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. From there, the National Disaster Mitigation Program took over in the mid-2010s to present day. As the NDMP phases out in 2022, the newest program, FHIMP, is set to provide funds to provinces and territories on a cost-shared basis for the next 3 fiscal years. Natural Resources Canada, or NRCan, has a strong role in flood mapping. As leaders in geomatics and remote sensing, we continuously acquire imagery and develop data sets that are foundational to flood mapping techniques. We aid in emergency flood response through our emergency geomatics services, most recently supporting the extreme flood events in British Columbia. And we provide technical guidance to the flood mapping process via our guideline series. Upon the announcement of Budget 2021, the government tabled a recovery plan for jobs, growth, and resilience with specific investments to promoting a healthy environment for a healthy economy. Within this budget, $145.5 million was identified to support initiatives that will increase resiliency towards natural hazards, specifically wildfires and floods. Funding from this budget will support 3 separate programs, including a new flood hazard identification and mapping program, which is designed to complete flood maps in higher risk areas. More specifically, Budget 2021 proposes to provide $63.8 million over 3 years, starting in 21-22, to work with provinces, territories to complete flood maps for higher risk areas, investing $30.1 million for cost-shared flood mapping projects. The FHIMP is a collaborative program with our partners at Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as Public Safety. Each department has their own expertise and well-defined role, with the ultimate goal of advancing flood mapping in Canada and mapping the highest priority areas. In general, the foundations of FHIMP are simple: work with high-quality data and science in a collaborative effort while supporting our partners, and include climate change knowledge and uncertainty. As defined in our federal flood mapping framework, there are many aspects to flood mapping, all of which are centered around engagement. Under FHIMP, a large portion of flood-related activities are eligible for cost sharing with the provinces and territories, with the focus on data acquisition, flood studies, data dissemination, and engagement. It's important to note, while many of you may be familiar with the flood mapping framework, eligible FHIMP activities are highlighted in yellow, beginning with data acquisition, which considers LiDAR, terrain, meteorological, and historical data, to hazard assessment, which could include anthropogenic changes, impact in natural processes such as climate change, flood assessments, which include hydrologic and hydraulic studies, and map production and dissemination. Flood mapping projects under this program must meet several requirements and should be planned with 3 basic considerations. The projects are to be cost shared with the provinces and territories, 50-50 with the provinces, and 75-25 with the territories, NRCan to be paying the larger portion. The contributions from each jurisdiction can be either in kind or cash, and the project's selection and prioritization is to be conducted in a collaborative, co-designed manner. Requirements for the project are: maps must be suitable for regulatory purposes. They must apply the federal flood mapping guidelines or equally as stringent jurisdictional guidelines. They must consider the impact of climate change, and the maps generated under the FHIMP program must be made publicly available, either through the jurisdiction's owned needs or through NRCan's flood mapping portal. As the FHIMP is a national program, allocations of the available funds plays an important role in which projects can be cost shared. An initial distribution was determined through a national assessment that considered 3 criteria: exposed population to flooding, exposed Indigenous population to flooding, and the total average annual loss due to flooding by each jurisdiction. These 3 criteria combined allow for a high-level analysis by province and territory for which an initial allocation amount can be determined. The weighting of each criteria are available above, with 70% being assigned to the exposed population, 20% to the exposed Indigenous population, and 10% for the total flood average annual loss. A baseline of $500,000 was awarded to each jurisdiction, and the weighted criteria analysis distributed the remaining funds as shown in this table. A contingency of 15% the total funds available was withheld from the allocation to allow for flexibility in project prioritization as the program evolves. It's important to note that these numbers are estimates, and the program remains flexible to work with each jurisdiction, reflecting their capacity to cost share as well as develop flood mapping projects. Now that funding amounts, projects, requirements, and program goals have been identified, there are several next steps for NRCan as we continue to advance flood mapping in Canada. We will continue to identify and prioritize projects with the provinces and territories in a collaborative manner, prepare and sign agreements with each jurisdiction for these cost share projects, assist in the implementation of the FHIMP projects, and continue to support other key flood mapping activities. There are several other initiatives that are not only in support of the FHIMP program and also help to advance flood mapping in Canada, but that we think will be of interest to this stakeholder group. These programs are all being conducted within NRCan and have a severe impact on FHIMP's capability to succeed. As a requirement for FHIMP funding, climate change considerations must be addressed. There are no blanket solutions that will exist for flood mapping projects from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. However, NRCan does have resources to help in incorporating climate change considerations. Most notably, we encourage the implementation of the federal hydrologic and hydraulic procedures, specifically Section 10, which relates to climate change considerations. We reference the case studies that have been conducted on climate change as it relates to flood mapping, and we support the ongoing research being led by ECCC. Both the federal hydrologic and hydraulic procedures for flood hazard delineation and case studies on climate change and floodplain mapping are available through NRCan's website. As noted throughout the presentation, NRCan is developing the Federal Flood Mapping Guidelines Series. Under the Emergency Management Strategy, NRCan has engaged with other federal departments, agencies, private industry, and academia to develop a series of documents that provide direction for all stages of flood mapping in Canada. The level of completion or status of each of these documents varies from published to draft. However, a version 1.0 for each of these documents is planned for the near future. These documents, as mentioned previously, are all available on NRCan's website. Additionally, some of these guidelines are in the process of becoming standardized throughout works with the Standard Council of Canada. The first 2 guidelines identified for this major step are the Airborne LiDAR Data Acquisitions and Geomatics Guidelines for Flood Mapping Series. We are also in the process of updating the National Hydrographic Network to better support flood mapping practitioners with a new version, the NHN 2.0, which will offer greater analysis capabilities with analysis-ready data. The National Flood Hazard Data Layer is Canada's most comprehensive flood database. The NFHDL, which is developed through consultation with provinces and territories, establishes a national flood hazard model for consistency across the country and incorporates all flood study areas, old or new, that have been made available to NRCan. As shown in the above figure, the NFHDL includes floodway, flood fringe, flood hazard, and historic flood extent layers. A component or subset of the NFHDL is the Historic Flood Event Database, which consolidated historic data from provinces, territories, and public safety. The historic maps were enhanced with improved naming conventions, data positioning, and rainfall data provided by ECCC. The Historic Flood Event Database is set to be available this year through the federal Geospatial platform, while the NFHDL is to be requested from each jurisdiction due to the IP constraints. NRCan is leading the development of a Government of Canada elevation data strategy to make available high-resolution elevation data coverage for Canada to create new capacities and better support key federal priorities. Currently, the high-resolution elevation dataset covers 84 of Canada's 100 largest cities, and 7 more have acquisitions slated for spring of 2022. This will cover over 30 million Canadians in a comprehensive LiDAR program. In the above map, you can see that all red areas indicate acquisitions that are currently in progress, while green areas are all datasets that have been acquired via the National Elevation Data Strategy. The yellow areas represent LiDAR that's been made available to us from other stakeholders or our provincial territorial partners, and the gray region in the north displays the digital surface model that's available at a 2-meter resolution. There are 3 available high-resolution elevation datasets. These include the High-Resolution Digital Elevation Model, or the HRDEM, the HRDEM Mosaic, which is intended to facilitate the use of this data, as well as the Automatically Extracted Buildings Layer, which is derived from airborne LiDAR data. These datasets are all available through the Web Map service for maps of geospatial data, or the Web Coverage service for interoperable access to raster data. NRCan is also in the development of a national flood susceptibility map, which aims to develop methodologies for creating a national dataset of flood susceptibility based on machine learning using historic events as the training data. The potential use cases for this work includes the support of the FHIMP program and also as an input dataset to CERNAC's-led Climate Risk Index. Steps for developing this map include the assembly of available datasets, determining the important ones, running of several models, evaluating their performances, selecting the optimal performing model, and applying it to the remainder of the country. The preliminary results of this work are available in the above map, where lighter colors are representative of a lower flood susceptibility and darker colors see an increase in flood susceptibility. We are currently in the process of performing further tests and some additional refinements to the data and model with hopes of having a dataset publicly accessible by the end of fiscal year. Following this, we hope to have a peer-reviewed publication which will come out shortly. Lastly, the Canadian Centre for Remote Sensing, a subgroup with NRCan and its Canada Centre for Mapping and Earth Observation, are actively working with a synthetic aperture radar available through the Radar Constellation mission. Through collaboration with the Canadian Space Agency, the European Space Agency, and Friedrich Schiller University Jena, a massive open online course has been developed that showcases Canadian synthetic aperture radar applications. More information and access to the course is available through the links on this slide. In summary, the FHIMP program is positioned to advance flood mapping in Canada with support from Environment, Climate Change Canada, Public Safety, and our provincial and territorial partners. We have a large portfolio of activities to support the program and are excited to be leading flood mapping works for the years to come. I'd like to thank everyone here for their time, and I'm now available for any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Hi, Brian.
Hey, how you doing?
Pretty good. Thanks for the presentation. I think Lindsay's going to be joining us as well from NRCan.
Hopefully. She is here, but is currently, oh, voila.
Hi, Tina Lindsay.
Technology.
Gotta love it.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. Thanks for joining us. Brian, Lindsay, why don't you just take a moment to introduce yourselves to the community and a little bit about your work at NRCan. Folks, we have the Q&A is open. Please put your questions in the Q&A system and we'll take it from there. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jonathan. So as my title says, I'm the engineering advisor here at NRCan's Canadian Centre for Mapping and Earth Observation. Actually more of a water resource engineer by trade, so not necessarily a geospatial wizard, but have been able to use the data to do some really interesting work over the past couple of years, working in the renewable sector and now in the flood mapping sector. So we're here to promote the FHIMP program, which we think is going to be a really positive impact on flood mapping over the next 2 to 3 years and beyond. So that's my role here.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. Lindsay?
Hi, Tina Lindsay. I'm the engagement coordinator with the provinces and territories on the new FHIMP program, and I previously worked on some of the supporting initiatives that Brian talked about, such as the National Flood Hazard Data Layer and the Historical Flood Events Layer. So happy to help answer any questions that I can.
Great. There's a couple questions in the Q&A, so why don't I get us started? You mentioned that flood mapping projects are to be co-designed with provinces and territories. Could you please elaborate on what that means? I would imagine that means CCOG in some form or another.
Yeah, so I mean, really what this comes down to is jurisdiction. So flood mapping has been given, the jurisdictional authority lies with provinces and the territories. So as a federal agency, we're here to help and fund and advance flood mapping, as we said. But at the end of the day, we need to be working with the provinces and territories to prioritize and select the projects that actually get implemented. So when we engage and reach out and speak with all of the different partners at this level, we want to ensure that they know that we're not here to prescribe projects. We're here to hear what they have to say, prioritize their works, and ensure that at the end of the day, we're mapping the highest priority areas, which has a lot of different ways to be interpreted.
Fantastic. Another question, the goal of the FHIMP program is to map the highest priority areas in Canada. What are the highest priorities areas and how are they selected? How are they defined?
Yeah, no, and so we call it the FHIMP program. Actually, it just kind of rolls off the tongue a little bit smoother. But in terms of high priority areas, it's like we said, there's different ways to interpret them. Is it the areas that constantly get flooded? Is the areas that don't have adequate mapping currently? So we, as a federal entity, took a first crack at it by prioritizing, the number of people who were exposed to flooding, the Indigenous population that's exposed to flooding, as well as the damages that come from flooding in those regions. And now we're taking that initial ranking and we're going to the provinces and territories and we're seeing what they have to say and getting their inputs because they might have more information about these high risk areas. So essentially it's an iterative process. And once we've had the chance to define with our partners what those high priority areas are in their regions, we'll start working towards mapping those. So there's no blanket answer, but it's really, many factors that go into determining a high priority area for flood mapping in Canada.
Great, thank you. A question I have, I think that'll help kind of explain a little bit about the importance of this work. How will the individual Canadian citizen, where would they feel the benefit of this program, the results on the ground? So I know our audience, we're the geospatial specialists, the engineers, the policy people, but what would eventually the impact on individual Canadian citizens be on benefits from this?
I think one of the core components that I mentioned earlier in the presentation really answers that question. And it's that these flood maps are going to be made publicly available. So in previous years and previous programs, that's not necessarily the case. Flood mapping, flood maps, regions at risk, those aren't necessarily well defined and available to the general populace. So with this program, we're going to develop these flood maps and make them available so that everyone knows exactly at what exposure or at what chance of flooding their properties, their houses, their schools, their public facilities are at risk too. And I think that's really important And that's why we've made it one of the core priorities of this program.
Sounds like it'll have a big impact in areas like insurance and financing and planning.
Definitely. The insurance companies are quite advanced in terms of their flood mapping. But again, that's proprietary information that isn't necessarily available to the general population. And there's no really, acknowledged impact to, if the whole of Canada knew exactly what their exposure risk was. So we believe it's a priority that people understand exactly what their chance of flooding or flood risk is, and we're going to work towards developing that as a program here.
Fantastic, thank you. There's another question. You mentioned that LiDAR data is available for most of the cities of Canada. Is the data freely available for other projects like cross-country infrastructure, etc.? And then that kind of finishes for any private companies.
Okay, so in terms of the LiDAR, the graphic that we showed earlier, the HRDEM, so it's anything north of the 60th parallel, that's openly and actively available. And then I believe the majority of the LiDAR information that we have is available as well, either through the Open Maps platform or through FGP. So that all that information is accessible. In terms of the infrastructure, roadway networks and whatnot, I can't speak to that, but I can say if you're looking for information, the best place to look is Open Maps. There's a really large inventory of publicly accessible geospatial data there.
Fantastic. And you mentioned some links in your talk. Obviously, people can't click on the links in the video presentation. If you could share those links in the chat, the entire audience will have access to that right now. And we can also make that available in the Slack channel after the presentation. So I just wanted to mention that would be useful to everybody. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. We'll consolidate all those links and make them available through this chat here.
Great. We've got a question in from Alexis. Looking at the NFHDL, I believe you noted this layer may be available this year. Will this be available through NRCan or disseminated through the provinces?
Yeah, so for the National Flood Hazard Data Layer, a portion of it, the historic events, we are looking to get it up and running through Open Maps this year, so that'll be hosted by NRCan. However, the full NFHGL, which composes all the flooding information that we have, is needed to be accessed via the provinces and territories because they are the jurisdictional authority on that data.
Fantastic. Another question here coming in from Pierre Bilodeau. NRCan will host the FHIMP, I think I got it this time, Industry Engagement Day on the 13th of April. What capacities do you need from industry?
Yes, that is correct. So we are hosting Industry Day in April, and associated to that will be an RFI. So looking to just get as much information from the private sector as we can. In terms of what we need from them, well, we need to know their capacities to do the work, as well as any form of specializations or previous experience that might be applicable to a challenging region. We have lots of partners who are looking to do flood mapping in the north, and they really need to see your capacity to do work up there due to the challenges of ice jams and freezing, for example. So the information that you can provide will help us to essentially engage private industry to do the work that we're looking to have completed for flood mapping in Canada.
Fantastic. Question here from Irene. Is there any work relating to prediction? For example, using satellite images or other aerial sensor data to monitor weather trends and potential affected geo areas before the flooding happens?
So flood prediction is a very important industry and a very important activity, but it's not in the FHIMP program. We are specifically looking here at mapping and generating maps. So all the work that goes into that process of data acquisition, all the way to the actual development and publication of those maps is what we're focused on. We have partners at ECCC who are working on that work, and that kind of shoes in nicely to the climate change modeling that they are also working on. But us specifically in the FHIMP program, that's not a consideration for us.
Great. There's another question. It looks like it's in reference into something that was already said, so it's a bit disjointed. It says, how does it translate to applications? Maybe they mean FHIMP applications in e.g. development constraints, or are these FYIs only for provincial and municipal users?
Perhaps they're speaking of the requirements and considerations that I mentioned earlier about how we're going to greenlight projects or greenlight funding essentially. And they're not FYIs, you know, so when we are developing these agreements between provinces and territories, or when they are looking to, you know, put an RFP and get bidders, we do need them to meet all the criteria that I did explain previously in the meeting. And so I hope that I answered that question to whoever that posted that.
Thank you. Another question from Irene. Oh no, we answered that one. So we have a little bit more time for Q&A, but we are coming up to the next break. Brian, is there anything you want to leave us with, a final thought on FHIMP or any other work NRCan is doing? We've got the DG panel tomorrow at the end of the day. I don't know if you're going to be tuning in for that. I'm very excited about it. We've got your DG, Eric Loubier, Eric La Liberté from the CSA, and David Harper joining us. Yeah, just any closing remarks?
Yeah, well, I'll definitely be present for that. I think it's a really good opportunity to listen to some very knowledgeable people who have a lot of influence in this realm. But in terms of my closing remarks, I would say that you know, we are here in a supporting role. We're here to, you know, advance flood mapping, support projects, and get knowledge out to the Canadian people. So if there's any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, thoughts, anything, please feel free to reach out because we know we're a springboard for advancing this sector.
Thank you very much, Brian. And I want to thank NRCan for presenting this very important talk on flood mapping. Our theme is climate change. This hits home on that. I think it was really well done. We really appreciate the federal government participating in GeoIgnite.
No, thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to speaking with everyone tomorrow.
Great. All right, everybody, we're heading to the break. Coming up next, we're going to be talking with Planet's got a presentation about new applications for satellite data for agriculture. So I'm really interested in that talk. That sounds really fascinating to me. We've got Agriculture Canada with us as well at GeoIgnite. So we're going to be hitting that topic a couple of times. Planet is a gold sponsor of GeoIgnite. This event wouldn't be possible without them. Please visit the conference website to view all our sponsors, not just our platinum, gold, and silver, but all the associations, media, and events that have helped spread the word about the Canada's National Geospatial Conference. I'll see everybody on the other side of the break.